listening to Overwatch League Daily, your daily source for Overwatch League news, scores, and more. Here's your host, KickedTripod.
Hey, good morning, Overwatch League fans. This is your Overwatch League Daily episode for January 17th, 2018. The first week of Overwatch League has come and passed. Today, my guest really needs no introduction. It's Hexagrams, here to discuss a variety of topics from his thoughts on Week 1, his opinions on Week 2, and more. So before we jump into everything, I would really love to just kind of get your perspective on Week 1. There was obviously a lot of hype from us at home getting to watch it for the very first time, but what was it like for you preparing for the first week? And what was the energy like once everything finally came to fruition, that recording began to happen and you realized that you were live?
Well, preparing for Overwatch is generally just watching as much Overwatch as possible. So in that vein, I felt I was pretty prepared coming into things and knowing the teams. Of course, you always do individual prep on teams, but I was actually very lucky that I got to be a part of the preseason, kind of as a last-second addition to that desk. So I was able to see these teams in their final form. That also helped me in preparation a lot, just being in Los Angeles, in the studio, just knowing where things are, knowing where the green room is, knowing where rehearsal is. And so that was a lot of stress that was taken away from me going into the actual opening night. Preparing was a little bit difficult because I had to travel out here, get an apartment. That was all taken care of in late December. And then Semler, who I'm casting with, wasn't able to get into the country until early January, so we didn't have a whole lot of time to actually work together. I think we got maybe one practice cast in before we had to go live, but luckily, he's such a good professional that I knew it wasn't going to be an issue. Now the rest were even really worried about preparing casting with each other, and I'm actually very happy with how those first casts went off, given the lack of time we really had as a duo. The energy for opening night was absolutely insane. I was lucky to have the first day off of casting, so me, Semler, and Mr. X, I believe, just sat in the audience and wanted to see what it was like. And when the timer went off and the video starts rolling, it was just insane. It's one of those moments that I think I'll remember forever. It was absolutely surreal. Everything had been work going into that for years, and then Overwatch League is finally a reality. And I mean, as hyped as the fans were, I can say that the people who were a part of it were just as excited, and it was just as surreal for the rest of us. And I hope it continues onward like that, and hopefully it will continue onward like that.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on a couple of the matches from the last week. One thing that I was really surprised with was how dominant the LA Valiant were in Week 1, especially against the Fuel. Do you think that the Valiant have what it takes to be a top-tier team and challenge the big three of Seoul, London, and New York?
I think that the Valiant are a very good team, and I would expect them to be contending for one of those playoff spots right now. Not enough can be said about the additions they made to this roster, and I've said at length about how good Unko and Soon are. And then you add them to an already very good roster with Kareev, Agilities. You're going to add Space later to this roster too. Envy and Fate played really, really well. So I wasn't actually that surprised that the Valiant were as good as they are. I think I'm a little surprised that they're 2-0 given the teams that they had to play against, but I can see them contending for a playoff spot. I still think, though, that those big three are the big three for a reason. Of course, all the Korean players are very good. The Valiant can start taking maps and maybe improve off of that. But right now, I still think it is the big three, then maybe another 3 or 4 teams you think are in the playoffs, and then kind of everybody else. But I expect the Valiant to continue to improve a little bit. But I think essentially the starting players that you saw in the Valiant are the players that you're going to see throughout the rest of the season. Contend, maybe, but I still think they are a step behind those big three teams.
Shifting over to some of the player individual performances that we saw this past week, were there any players that really impressed you from Week 1?
There's so many players who had such good weeks in Week 1. I think, of course, you start off the conversation with a player like Pine, who came in and simply dominated the 2 maps that he played. He's this final boss of Ilios. He had some of the craziest McCree play I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot of Overwatch. That was a just dominant performance on that map. Fleta did it across the board on every hero you could have asked him to play. He was hitting just insane direct hits on his Pharah, excuse me. And I think that he's a player that is very potentially in the MVP discussion right now, if not the straight up MVP. I mentioned a little bit about Valiant being so good because of Soon on that team. I think that he is probably my MVP if I say most valuable player. I don't think that the Valiant are 2-0 without Soon. He's playing a brand of Tracer that is really fun to watch, a Tracer that's always alive, always annoying. His life total is just insane. He's alive longer than most other Tracers, so he's just constantly a problem for that team. And I think he has been one of the interesting players because he's had ups and downs. He was dominant in Western teams, then he had kind of a falling off period, and now he's definitely back in full force. I think, you look at Yonak, who just was an incredible support player. And then another Western player that maybe some teams didn't really know how good he was coming into this is Dream Casper. He played a lot of different heroes, and his Roadhog was one of the best Roadhogs that we've seen in all of Overwatch, and he's a player definitely on the rise. Definitely keep an eye out for him going forward. But there's a lot of players impressed. Those are a quick 5 off the top of my head.
What matches are you looking forward to the most this week?
I would have to say that Thursday is going to be a pretty banner day, and Friday as well. I think a lot of people expected more out of Dallas early on, and on Thursday they're going to play Houston. Houston has also been a team that a lot of people expected more out of, and of course that's the what's bigger in Texas kind of rivalry. Excelsior and Valiant play after that, and I think if we want to really gauge where Valiant is at, NYXL would be a great challenge for them going forward. Then later in the week, you also have Spitfire in Dallas. Again, this is kind of the week where Dallas has to make or break because they could very easily lose both of these matches and be 0-4, and that is not what anyone expected out of them going forward. And again, the test for Valiant, they'll have to play Spitfire on Saturday. That should be an amazing matchup as well. So really, I want to see the top teams matching up against each other, where they're at, and I think we're going to start to see a better picture of the overall league when those top teams have to play each other. And maybe it's not necessarily Valiant winning a matchup against NYXL, but if they can keep it close and they look like they were a play or two away, then I think that speaks volumes. I also want to see Philadelphia continue to play well because they were a bit of a surprise team coming out. But there's a lot of good games this week. I can go through most of them and expect very high level play, but I think this is the week that Dallas kind of either makes or breaks for themselves. At the very least, they have to show themselves being more competitive on certain maps and map types and maybe figure out who's going to actually play on that roster.
So last week, we finally got to see the Philadelphia Fusion in all their glory. Did they perform to your expectations? What were your big takeaways from their performance?
Now, Philadelphia did surprise some people this week, but I think that it's not necessarily surprise, more just that they were an unknown quantity. They had some logistical issues trying to get the team into Overwatch League on time, so they didn't necessarily have the practice that a lot of other teams have. But just on paper, which is a very fragile term, especially when you're talking about sports and competition, this team has so much talent that you figured they would have it figured out when they got here. You've got players on this team like Carpe and Shadowburn, of course, who are going to get all the credit in the world, and why not when you have DPS monsters like them? Look, Shadowburn had another period of time where he wasn't playing all that great, but not only is his Genji back in full form, but his Pharah is something to be reckoned with. You've got supports like Boombox, who made the name for themselves in the previous year in the Contenders series, and I think when you have a Zenyatta in this meta, you're going to be in good shape. Can't say enough about the tank play for this team. Poco with amazing self-destructs, but let's also give a lot of credit to Fraggy. Fraggy, who is always well known as one of the best Reinhardts in the league, and why not? He got an Earthshatter, I believe, on Control Center before the point even unlocked. You know what you're going to get with a very aggressive Reinhardt play out of Fraggy, but I was almost more impressed with his Winston. A lot of the reasons that Poco got the bombs that he got over top and getting those kills was Fraggy's on the ground, pushing people into these sight lines, especially in his Winston play, knocking people around. I think this team is playing very well right now. You even can talk about Neptuno on his Mercy play. I believe he got a 3 elimination streak just from that Mercy, and they've got a lot of players they can still sub in from the bench who are going to add a lot of depth to this team. I think it's so smart for teams to max out their rosters to have 12 players, because sometimes fatigue will get there, but also just having extra eyes on the game and having outside perspectives. It's like having 6 player coaches. So while Philadelphia may have surprised a lot of teams, I think that if you just look at the pure talent they've assembled on this roster, it's not ultra surprising that they played as well as they did.
We did have one question come up from all the aspiring casters and analysts out there. What they really wanted to know is, going back to your beginnings as a caster and an analyst, which trait did you have to improve the most to get where you are right now? And how did your path of improvement look like?
Maybe not a lot of people know this, especially people newer to Overwatch, but I've only been casting games, period, for about 2 years. Overwatch was my very first game. I started casting in the closed beta, and those early tournaments were a little bit rough. Beyond that, I've really only been doing live events, which are a whole different animal, for about the past year. My first event was in November of 2016, which was a DreamHack event. And that's my very first live event. So obviously there's a lot to learn from that. And because I am still so new to this, I'm trying to improve everything at a constant rate. There's so many tiers of what makes a caster good, in my opinion anyway. You start off with game knowledge. Everyone needs to have that game knowledge and come in with that. That's like step 1 for it. Step 2 maybe is just your actual broadcast mechanics. And that's something I've had to work on a lot. When I first started, inflection was difficult for me. Finding the right energy, finding the right flow can also be difficult. So you're constantly trying to figure out, when is it right to be hype? When is it right to bring it back? And you need to have that rhythm so that the audience can stay up with you. Being hype all the time can be a little exhausting, not only as a caster, but also to the audience. So knowing those moments, I think one of the things I've worked on the most, and I hope has improved, is my on-the-fly analysis, which is a whole different animal than sitting down with a VOD and looking at this happened and this happened. You have to see it at the point. And what's very difficult about high-level Overwatch is that there's about 10 good things that happened in every fight. So you have to pick out which is the most important thing and go on that, and then create the narrative there. Narrative structure also becomes a huge idea, and a lot of people have different ways of doing it. I particularly like to find certain players and follow their story throughout a match, but weaving that thread of this is what happened in map 1, and this is affecting them in map 4 is a continuity issue that has to happen. Further than that, I think one of the highest levels of casting, when you have both those things down, that you can do them at second nature, of having your game knowledge and doing analysis and making sure your voice is proper and your broadcast mechanics are there, is just trying to make it entertaining. At the end of the day, it's an entertainment industry, and not every time is time for jokes and banter. But those are the casters that I've always found the most entertaining, whether it's my colleagues now who I love watching or people in previous esports. What's great about them is that there's times in every game, and maybe Overwatch least among them, where there is a lull. There's not everything going on. And granted, in Overwatch, those are lesser than others, but you have to take the time to be personable and be entertaining and maybe find a way to crack a joke and say something witty, because almost anyone can come into the game and know the game very well and then start analyzing very quickly. But can you do it in an entertaining fashion? Can you do it where people want to tune into you when you're watching a game that maybe isn't the highest level of game, which isn't supposed to be the highest level of gameplay? Well, people still want to watch because you can entertain them. And that's something I'm still working on. I mean, I'm still working on all of it constantly. And you only get better by doing it as often as possible, practicing. And some people don't know, like, even high-level casters will go home that night and practice cast games, or at the very least, you have to review your own video and say, man, I wish I could have done this here and this there, and just having it in the back of your head constantly. So self-review and self-analysis, and I'm hoping to continue to improve. I still feel like the new kid on the block. It's been a surreal couple of years, to be extremely honest, and I'm just blessed to be where I am and hope to continue to improve.
My thanks to Hex for joining me on the show today. Make sure to follow him on Twitter at Hexagrams. And of course, tune into the Overwatch League to listen and watch him cast and analyze the matches. If you missed it, yesterday I sat down with LA Valiant head coach Cuddles to discuss some of the Valiant's early successes as well as some of their coaching strategies going into the first season. Remember, you can find the show on any of your favorite podcast outlets, including iTunes, Stitcher, Podcast Addict, and Google Podcast. We're also on YouTube. Click on the link in the show notes to find us, or go to youtube.com/KickedTripod. If you want to stay in touch, email me at overwatchleaguedaily@gmail.com, tweet me at OWL Daily Show, or join our Discord at discord.me/OWL Daily Show. And of course, as always, you can find links to everything at overwatchleaguedaily.com. with that, thanks so much for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow where I'll be joined by Avril to discuss tonight's games. See you guys.